Hello, and welcome to Reading the Victorian Novel, A Tale of Two Cities by Charles Dickens. I'm Dr. Christian Lehman, and today we pick up with the sixth part, sixth monthly number, and it is from November of 1859. We'll be talking about Book 3, chapters 1 to 7. All right, as a quick chapter review, we have now entered the third book. So Tale of Two Cities is after its initial publication, divided into three parts, or actually during it. So chapter 3:1, in secret, Darnay goes to France and is thrown into La Force in solitary confinement. Chapter 2, the grindstone, are the September massacres, and Lucy comes to France. In chapter 3, the shadow, Lucy meets Madame Defard. Chapter 4, the calm in the storm, Manette gains influence, and we have the personification of La Guillotine. And then chapter 5, the wood sawyer, we have the fantastic dance, Carmagnole. Chapter 6, triumph, Darnay is freed. Chapter 7, a knock at the door, Darnay is arrested yet again. So in this lecture, I want to offer a content warning. I will be talking about racism and sexual violence and assault in the first half of the lecture, particularly around chapter 3:2, the grindstone. All right, but we pick up with Charles Darnay's arrest and placement into solitary confinement. So here is how we have the prisoners described in La Force. So strangely clouded were these refinements by the prison manners and gloom, so spectral did they become in the inappropriate squalor and misery through which they were seen, that Charles Darnay seemed to stand in a company of the dead, ghosts all. The ghost of beauty, the ghost of stateliness, the ghost of elegance, the ghost of pride, the ghost of frivolity, the ghost of wit, the ghost of youth, the ghost of age, all waiting their dismissal from the desolate shore, all turning on him eyes that were changed by the death they had died in coming there. So Dickens is not the first to present the idea of being in prison as a kind of lived death. A lot of Dickens's experiences with prisons came from touring them. Prison tours were a 19th century mode of entertainment or even edification. And so Dickens famously visits Newgate, and then he also in America during his first American trip visited and first cried out against the practice of solitary confinement. What I'm interested in here, though, is the density of this language of spectrality and ghosts, and especially the echoes you might hear with the ghost of elegance, of pride, frivolity, wit, right? This comes out of the patterning in the opening of A Tale of Two Cities. And so we're having a really kind of nice echo, only now it's all around death. There isn't really the balance. Everything dies here. So we don't even have a vast extreme. A quick literary allusion when it says the desolate shore. This is a reference to crossing the river Styx or Lethe, depending on your version, or even the Acheron, rivers of the underworld. So how do you go from one to the other? Specifically, this has quite Dantesque elements there from the Inferno. And just in terms of admiration, I just, like the wordplay on death has died. It's what's called an accusative infinitive. All right, here we get into some of the racism. So this is book 3, chapter 2, page 272 in the Penguin, and describing the grindstone. The grindstone had a double handle, and turning at it madly were two men, whose faces, as their long hair flapped back when the whirlings of the grindstone brought their faces up, were more horrible and cruel than the visages of the wildest savages in their most barbarous disguise. So here, Dickens is drawing on stereotypes of indigenous Americans. At various points in his career, he paints these people in different ways. So in American Notes, he has a quite celebratory passage of a wise native man who he met and spent time with on a coach. But more often you have this rendering, which is calling Native people wild and calling them savage, and then also calling them barbarous. Three sort of racist dog whistles, implying that the British, from whose perspective Dickens is writing, would not be any of these things because they get to define what civility is, even though they are anything but civil so much of the time in their warfare. And then also here, we're in the middle of France, and Dickens is actually using these indigenous populations to say that what the French are doing is so much more repulsive to him. And so some interesting language here, right? This idea of a barbarous disguise. The first sort of popularizing of indigenous stereotypes did happen during the 19th century when people started bringing over indigenous people to put on display and have people pay money to look at them. So then we still see some Dickensian characteristics here, the internal rhyme of visages, the savages, and then the energy in the passage. The entire paragraph is really remarkable. So Kate Flint, in her short chapter, Dickens and the Native American, writes, this is on page 100, one diluted response to the fear of otherness is, of course, ridicule, and this option is taken up by Dickens. In Bleak House, he tries for a laugh on the apparent absurdity of the name Tokahupu Indians, on whom the zealously philanthropic Mrs. Pardigal has insisted that her eldest son bestow 5 and 3 of his pocket money. Quote, at the mention of the Tokahupu Indians, I could really have supposed Egbert to be one of the most baleful members of that tribe. He gave me such a savage frown, remarks Esther. So here, Dr. Flint is picking up on this other kind of throwaway quote in Bleak House, where we have Indians yoked to savagery in the mind of a British person, here a British woman. And in this chapter, Dr. Flint does look at a number of different uses that Dickens has of Native people, and what she kind of generalizes is that he most often sets them up in this way to be a contrast to kind of British propriety. If you've ever seen the Peter Pan, the animated Disney Peter Pan, you have seen some of these stereotypes at play. Okay, we're now going to talk about violence against women. This is also in that same paragraph. So I'll repeat the sentence that I read and then continue. The grindstone had a double handle, and turning at it madly were 2 men, whose faces, as their long hair flapped back when the whirlings of the grindstone brought their faces up, were more horrible and cruel than the visages of the wildest savages in their most barbarous disguise. False eyebrows and false mustaches were stuck upon them, and their hideous countenances were all bloody and sweaty and all awry with howling, and all staring and glaring with beastly excitement and want of sleep. And then a little bit later in the paragraph, men in all sorts of rags, with the stain upon those rags, men devilishly set off, with spoils of women's lace and silk and ribbon, with the stain dyeing those trifles through and through. I'm going to come and explain why I've bolded false eyebrows and false mustaches in the next slide. But right now we have this language of spoils, which is what victors take. And it's women's lace, silk, and ribbon. So they've taken the finery from these women. And you'll see that then we have the stain dyeing those trifles through and through. The stain is blood. And placed right next to dyeing, we also have a pun on dyeing. Right? These are women that have been assaulted, probably killed, probably sexually abused by these men who are called beastly and devilish. And remember, they've also been compared to this stereotype, this anti-Indigenous racism up on top as being even worse than. And so we have all of these different elements happening. It's a really astonishing paragraph and a model of how like Dickensian energy and control can deal with really horrific topics. So about those mustaches. This is from Sanders' Companion. This would appear to be an extraordinary misreading of a passage in Carlyle. None of the commentators or eyewitness accounts of the September massacres, which Dickens was likely to have known, Carlyle, Mercier, Dr. John Moore, refers to the fact that the murderers disguised themselves with false hair. Dickens seems to have derived his notion from Carlyle's account of the murder of the Princess de Lamballe and the subsequent mutilation of her body at the prison of La Force on September 3rd. She shivers, and now he quotes Carlyle in the French Revolution. She shivers back at the sight of the bloody sabers, but there is no return. Onwards. That fair hind head is cleft with the axe. The neck is severed. That fair body is cut in fragments with indignities and obscene horrors of mustachio grand lèvres, which human nature would fain find incredible, which shall be read in the original language. And then quotes the French, which Sanders does not translate. And so what we have here, let me down so you can see it. In the translation, when the assassins had divided the bloody pieces of her body, one of these monsters cut off her virginal parts and made mustaches of it in the presence of spectators who were seized with horror and terror. So here we have the kind of displacement, but then also the presence of this violence that had happened, right? Specifically directed towards the genitals of a woman. And something else that I want to point to is this idea that's here that these acts are focused on female bodies, but we're also going to personify the guillotine as female. And remember the important role of Madame Defarge or the vengeance. So there's really complicated energies happening here. And even when the men put on these spoils of women's lace, silk, and ribbon, the use of and creates a polysyndeton that stretches it out, emphasizing each element separately. The men are almost disguising themselves, dressing in women's finery as they're doing these things. There's a lot of transgression that's happening in really problematic ways that are worth thinking about in a more thorough manner than I have time for here. But now let's turn to the grindstone itself before looking at a bunch of illustrations of it, because it's one of the most astonishing scenes that has inspired many artists. As these ruffians turned and turned, their matted locks now flung forward over their eyes, now flung backwards over their neck, some women held wine to their mouths that they might drink. And what with dropping blood, and what with dropping wine, and what with the stream of sparks stuck out the stone, all their wicked atmosphere seemed gore and fire. The eye could not detect one creature in the group free from the smear of blood. Shouldering one another to get next to the sharpening stone were men stripped to the waist with the stain all over their limbs and bodies. So the stain, again, stain of blood, but notice that repetition, it almost creates a whirling effect of what with, and then that the alliteration, stream of sparks struck out of the stone, it almost acts as the sibilance of the sparks coming off. So this scene had really inspired a lot of artists. So we are now going to look at them. I know usually I wait for the art until the end, but here I want to spend time. So we're going to look at these three that are on the screen right now in individualized form. So the first person to depict the moment is John McLennan, whose work we are quite familiar with. Here you can see the grinding stone, quite small. You see the man with their mustaches, right? Kind of oversized even, emphasizing the way that they are meant to be false mustaches. You see this man's gleeful smile, the others being focused, raising up their weapons to be sharpened, testing here the edge. In general, the energy of this one is pretty staid. Nobody's really seems to be moving. There's not a whirling. There's no real blending effect happening. And the reason I use some of that language is because of Fred Barnard's just absolute barnstormer in 1874 for the household edition. Here, you see we've increased the size of the grindstone. The men are they have their shirts off. The mustache is whirling upward. It's capturing that, the hair flopping back and forth as each of the men, his teeth are visible. And we just have this whirling energy where people tend to blend together and even blur together. Here is this woman rising up and over, pouring down the wine, which simultaneously goes into the bent's mouth, but also continues to wet the grindstone to continue sharpening these blades. Here, yeah, raising up a cup, having the knives at the ready. This person almost getting knocked down in the midst. We have the axe. This is just an extraordinary set of energy moving it. All the whirls and the interconnections happening there. Then this picks up. We have this almost abstract watercolor kind of from Harry Furness in the Charles Dickens Library edition from 1910. So there's the grindstone. And here we focus on the people rushing to it in a way. They also are blurring, going into the background. What is possibly a female figure, but I don't want to press that too hard, holding the rapier by the hand. And this fellow running out, wearing those clogs, and kind of comically stretching, testing the edge. So 3 incredibly different versions of an image that Fizz actually never took on. It is quite interesting in and of itself. All right, moving forward. Lucy seeks Madame Defarge's pity in the chapter called The Shadow. So this takes over 2 pages. As a wife and mother, cried Lucy most earnestly, I implore you to have pity on me and not to exercise any power that you possess against my innocent husband, but to use it in his behalf. Oh, sister woman, think of me as a wife and mother. Madame Defard looked, coldly as ever, at the suppliant and said, turning to her friend, the Vengeance, the wives and mothers we have been used to see since we were as little as this child, and much less, have not been greatly considered. We have known their husbands and fathers laid in prison and kept from them often enough. All our lives, we have seen our sister women suffer in themselves and in their children, poverty, nakedness, hunger, thirst, sickness, misery, oppression, and neglect of all kinds. So here we have just a number of strong contrasts. Lucy lists all of this gendered language, wife, mother, sister, woman, wife, mother, and then Defarge repeats it back to her, wives and mothers, sister, women. I'm drawing attention to this sister, women in particular. Keep that in your mind, this combination there. And see, it's like almost a new kind of familial relation that Lucy is trying to come up with. So it does not work, right? Like Madame Defarge cannot be supplicated in this manner, drawing attention to, drawing upon any kind of shared femininity. Lucy is making the wrong strategy. But she is active in this moment. She's trying to do something. And so that's kind of what I want to draw attention to, because in the next chapter, she's going to faint. I'm not going to look at that this time, though. All right, the personification of La Guillotine. So what I want to suggest here after I read this is, well, I'll suggest it now and then maybe again. La Guillotine is almost in contrast to Lucy. Even though it's an object, it's sharp, it's active, it's capable of death and pollution. So in some weird ways, the most dynamic woman, that's not Madame Defarge, is La Guillotine and not Lucy. It was the popular theme for jests. It was the best cure for a headache. It infallibly prevented the hair from turning gray. It imparted a peculiar delicacy to the complexion. It was a national razor which shaved close. Who kissed La Guillotine looked through the little window and sneezed into the sack. It was the sign of the regeneration of the human race. It superseded the cross. Models of it were worn on breasts from which the cross was discarded, and it was bowed down to and believed in where the cross was denied. It sheared off heads so many that it and the ground it most polluted were a rotten red. So this word pollution, right, carrying with it a strong critique of the sheer amount of blood that would have soaked the earth, right? If you've ever thought about what happens when you cut off a head, the blood is moving and getting pumped pretty close to the heart there, and it's just going to keep pumping. So I've already suggested my idea there that La Guillotine is an active female, which adds even more contrast to Lucy. In the Wood Sawyer chapter, we have this famous dance called the Carmagnole. And so I'm going to just read part of this here. Mostly it's another passage that really nicely captures Dickens's energy at these kind of crowd scene paragraphs, something that he does better than anybody else. If you've read Barnaby Rudge, you know that is the case. A moment afterwards, and a throng of people came pouring round the corner by the prison wall, in the midst of whom was the wood sawyer, hand in hand with the Vengeance. There could not be fewer than 500 people, and they were dancing like 5,000 demons. There was no other music than their own singing. They danced to the popular Revolution song, keeping a ferocious time that was like a gnashing of teeth in unison. Men and women danced together, women danced together, men danced together, as hazard had brought them together. At first, they were a mere storm of coarse red caps and coarse woolen rags, but as they filled the place and stopped to dance about Lucy, some ghastly apparition of a dance figure gone raving mad arose among them. They advanced, retreated, struck at one another's hands, clutched at one another's heads, spun round alone, caught one another and spun round in pairs until many of them dropped. While those were down, the rest linked hand in hand and all spun round together. Then the ring broke, and in separate rings of 2 and 4, they turned and turned until they stopped at once, began again, struck, clutched, and tore, and then reversed the spin, and all spun round another way. So to give us a brief taste of what this song sounds like, we're going to play La Carmagnole. All right, that's enough to kind of give you a taste of the upbeat sounds of the song that these people are singing as they rush around and terrify Lucy. Right. Continuing on. Here is the song with the refrain. Let us dance the Carmagnole, long live the sound, long live the sound. Let us dance the Carmagnole, long live the sound of the cannons. And as a sample verse, Antoinette had decided to drop us on our butts, but the plan was foiled and she fell on her face. So it's full of violence, it's full of mockery towards the elites. It's very fun. You can find it online and listen to the whole thing. So kind of to bring things to a close, I want to talk about Lucy's fairy story. So this she offers up to her daughter, and I like it for a number of reasons, mostly because it shows a little bit of inventiveness on Lucy's side. So we've seen her, in between her bout of fainting, kind of try to get Madame Defard on her side, and then she's going to come up with this story. It's not great. Don't get too excited. They went out, leaving Lucy and her husband, her father, and the child by a bright fire. Mr. Lorry was expected back presently from the banking house. Miss Pross had lighted the lamp, but had put it aside in a corner that they might enjoy the firelight undisturbed. Little Lucy sat by her grandfather, with her hands clasped through his arm, and he, in a tone, well, got it started, it's over. I misread this entirely, so we're cutting this out. This is not about Lucy telling a story. So forget that, but I'm too lazy to stop recording. Means we're also going to skip Lucy fairy telling here from Little Dorrit. Oh, well. I guess I can briefly mention this because it's Dr. Bennett that tells the story that it used to be very common to talk about Dickens and the fairy tale. So here we have 2 important books by Harry Stone and Michael Kotzen. And then this Social Dreaming, Dickens and the Fairy Tale is 2013 by Elaine Ostry. So showing it, it's still around and continues. But if you check out any of these, check out Harry Stone. Harry Stone is really good on Dickens and kind of the darker side of things. All right, illustrations. Here's Fizz. This is before the prison tribunal. So here you can see Charles Darnay talking to the tribunal. We have 2 sectors here. They're crowded around in a circle around him. And then you also have this group. Notice his red, his nose is bright red. He's gotten drunk, right? This is kind of more, it's chaotic. It shows the lack of control among these revolutionaries. They kind of, some of them wear the piecemeal parts of the trappings of soldiers, but they don't have any kind of structure of soldiers. And so they're sitting around drinking and passing out, laughing and smoking. In contrast to Charles Darnay, sitting upright, shoulders back. He's got this full coat on. Then here, this is a knock at the door where Charles is going to be rearrested. So there we have Dr. Manette, we have little Lucy, and we have the trio of guards coming to get him because he has been accused. Lucy simultaneously trying to protect Darnay, but also being protected by. They form a really nice trio, and Dr. Manette's intense eye contact at these guards, right? He had thought that he had saved Darnay. And to go through the McLennan illustrations, so in secret, here we see Darnay in his solitary prison, and then we see when he was assaulted by the guards who were mad at him, right? You are a cursed immigrant, but there he is up there, recognizable because he's the most put together. Then we have the grindstone. We already talked briefly about this, but over here we can see Lucy and Pross together. Calm in a Storm, really like this one at the header, where we see a father showing off a toy guillotine to his son, building out of that idea that it was everywhere. And then there is the wood sawyer, formerly the mender of the roads, with his little guillotine, which is his saw that he calls it. And there we see young Lucy and mother Lucy looking up at the window of La Force, where they are present because perhaps Charles can see them. And then we have the next image. This is from a triumph where the men, after having voted to release Charles, put him up on a big chair and paraded him through the streets. And there he is getting rearrested, perhaps. So with Lucy clutching him in that way. And that brings us to a close. I am going to divide the next videos up into 2 different videos, even though when it was published as a monthly number, it was published just in one, but I don't want it to get too mammoth of a size. All right.